There are a lot of unexpected impacts from shifting environmental conditions, and we used to have projections that the sea ice would remain fairly constant well into the 21st century. And in recent years we found that all of those assumptions simply had to be thrown out because we were simply looking at the extent of sea ice rather than the total volume. And actually the sea ice kept getting thinner and thinner, and now we have to deal with situations in which you have to deal with increased oil development in the Arctic. This has been stop and go, of course, but there are expectations that it will happen. Increased shipments in the Arctic, including of oil and natural gas. And with that, all the responsibilities from the Arctic nations to deal with search and rescue, deal with environmental cleanup of potential accidents, any sort of stewardship, and from the military point of view, not just the search and rescue, but what they refer to as the ISR capabilities, the ability to maintain reconnaissance and governance in the region. Because in order to establish sovereignty, of course, you have to actually be there. And in the past, it was enough simply to have Soviet or US subs under the ice once in a while. But now, if people are actually going to these regions, there has to be some sort of extension of the capabilities of countries like Russia, of the US, of Canada, Norway. And the capabilities are very lacking. Now, in terms of how Canada sees this, I think it's shifting. It's probably rapidly shifting. There was recently the election in Canada, and over the last 10 years, there's been, I think, a stifled discussion about the nature of security in the Arctic and how it links to issues such as energy security, the viability of First Nations communities, so the native communities that live in the Arctic. And ultimately, those are the key issues that Canada has to deal with. Many of the international concerns would have to do with the Northwest Passage, and is this domestic territory or not? I actually think those can be dealt with through the Arctic Council or through bilateral agreements, whether it's between Canada and the US or other countries. But the First Nations community is a huge pressing issue, meaning Canada, in order to, if it has a sovereignty policy, which it has had over the years, then those communities that live in the north, they have to survive somehow. And what we found is that with the changing sea ice, with the melting permafrost, with all these environmental conditions, that the ability of these communities to rely upon traditional sources of food have been breaking down. And the costs of importing food from Ottawa or other cities is absolutely horrendous. So the human security aspect in the Arctic is a very real consideration for translation then to national and international security. And there have been a great number of communities within Canada who've tried to address this, but I think there needs to be more sustained focus from the Canadian federal government on what are the climate risks, how does it affect these smaller communities, what resources should be invested in these communities to adapt, and then how does that fit in then to a larger security strategy of Canada, to whether it's search and rescue, whether it's patrol, and all of this has to be re-questioned now. Many of the discussions have been stifled, not just within the military, but also within the scientific community of Canada. There were restrictions on government scientists talking to the media, and my hope is at least that with the new government that these restrictions will be eased and that the necessary expert networks within Canada that we need to do assessments of where the vulnerabilities lie, where the risks lie, what the changes might look like in the future, that those can now be reestablished, that we can have free flow of information in a way that was difficult, say, in the past 10 years. And Canada needs to really look at how those environmental changes are going to play out in ways that impact its energy security strategies. And for domestic politics in Canada, this is supremely important. And no one should discount that, okay, a lot of the oil and energy industries are located in Alberta, but to sort of ask, what's Canada's future going to look like? Is there going to be an emphasis on fossil fuel and fossil fuel extraction from areas like Alberta? Is there going to be a shift to Arctic regions, in which case there'll be perhaps competition with the US or the Chinese? Or will there be a greater investment in renewable resources over the next however many years? And I think Canada also needs to look towards the Pacific. It is very much a Pacific country. It is part of the Pacific multilateral institutions. And increasingly, I think the Pacific and the environmental changes in the Pacific, from the Arctic all the way down to the South Pacific, are going to affect Canadian well-being and risks, whether it comes from trade, whether it comes from environmental hazards that affect the West Coast, such as British Columbia, or whether it affects Canada's relations with its partners, such as the United States, Japan, Singapore, or its trading partners, such as China. And I think we have a space now to ask these larger questions about what does Canada want to be as a country? What does it want to accomplish? And perhaps go back to what everyone knew as Canada in the 1990s, of really being a leader on these environmental security questions. And not simply asking the right questions, but having the expertise to address them and do the assessments and set up the strategies as well.